Welcome everyone to today's talk by Aline Godfroid in the UCL Center for Applied Linguistics seminar series. It's lovely to see so many of you and from so many parts of the world. This is wonderful. I'm Andrea Revesz. I'm a member of the UCL Center for Applied Linguistics, and I'll be hosting this talk with the help of Jim McKinley and Ana Pellicer-Sanchez. So moving on to Aline, it's a great pleasure to introduce Aline Godfroid as the speaker for today's talk. Aline received her PhD from the University of Brussels, and currently she is an associate professor in second language studies and TESOL at Michigan State University. Her primary research interests are in the areas of psycholinguistics, vocabulary, quantitative research methods, and eye-tracking methodology. She has more than 40 publications in this area, which is an impressive number in and of itself, but what makes it even more impressive that most of her publications have appeared in top international journals. The outstanding quality of her work is also reflected in a number of awards she received in recognition of her work. She was the recipient of the 2019 TESOL Award for Distinguished Research and the co-recipient more recently of the Best of the Modern Language Journal Award scheme. You would think this is a really amazing list already, but in addition to that, her book on eye-tracking in second language acquisition and bilingualism was a finalist for the AAA First Book Award. Last but not least, I have just discovered that she's not only an excellent academic, but also an inventor. She was part of a team that designed a Mandarin Chinese language learning application called Picky Birds. As you can tell, Aline is really a star in the field of SLA. So again, it's a great privilege to have her with us today. So please join me in welcoming her. And now I hand over to her.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And thank you for the warm introduction, the warm words and the warm invitation. I'm really thrilled to be back at UCL and be given an opportunity to present recent work here at the seminar series. So thank you all for coming to my talk. It's a little after 9 a.m. on the East Coast this morning, so welcome everybody. My talk today is on the role of attention in second language acquisition and how we can use eye tracking to investigate questions with regards to attention in SLA. And for today, I'm envisioning the following roadmap along the way for this talk. I'll start off with by providing a gentle introduction to eye tracking methodology or eye movement registration, so that we all share and start with common knowledge about the methodology here. And after that, I will illustrate what eye tracking can do in an attentional research paradigm using two recent studies that I've conducted with collaborators at Michigan State University. And finally, hopefully by that time you're excited about the methodology, and I'll leave you with some methodological as well as conceptual pointers on how we can design informative eye tracking studies. So as Andrea mentioned, I work in the Second Language Studies program at Michigan State University. And in the Second Language Studies program, I co-direct the Second Language Studies eye tracking lab. And here's the website of our lab. If you'd like to, take a look and see who we are, what we do, and potentially how you could get involved if you're interested. The URL is eyetrack.msu.domains. And in our lab, this is the building where our lab is situated. I'm guessing this picture, this is Wells Hall, was probably taken in late spring, maybe in May or early June. Currently, everything is covered in a layer of snow, so it does look a little different right now. But this is where we work, where we're based, and where our eye trackers are. And so we have two of them. We have an iLink 1000 that is manufactured by SR Research in Canada. You see the eye tracker here, and it records images of the eye at 1,000 hertz, which amounts to one snapshot of the eye every 1 millisecond, or 1,000 measurements of the eye per second. We also have a Tobii TX300 from the Tobii company in Sweden, which records eye movements at 300 hertz, which is about one recording, one snapshot of the eye every 3.33 milliseconds, so 300 measurements per second. Both of these are considered high-speed eye trackers that can provide us with really fine-grained temporal information about how long people are looking at certain areas on the screen as they are engaging in various language tasks. Now, we have a little bit of a division of labor going on between these two eye trackers. As you can see here on the left, we tend to use our iLink 1000 with a headrest and chin rest. And this is to stabilize any head movements that a participant might make while they're looking on the screen. And so what this allows us to do is to get maximally accurate recordings and to look at really very small areas on the screen at the level of individual words, or sometimes even below the word level at a morphological level, to see how participants are processing this information. Conversely, we tend to use the Tobii eye tracker in a head free to move mode. As you can see here, the participant sitting in front of the screen is free to move her head. And this provides us with a little bit more ecological validity. Now, if we look at the dissertations that we have directed in the program over the last 10 years or so, this is reflected in the topics that these dissertations are about. So with the Tobii eye tracker, there have been several doctoral dissertation projects in the area of language assessment, as well also as work in the looking and listening paradigm, which is a paradigm to study listening, to study auditory language processing that involves larger areas, larger pictures on the screen. The iLink 1000 and its successor, the Portable Duo, have been used in psycholinguistic research primarily, where we investigate questions with regard to vocabulary and grammar acquisition, looking at smaller areas on the screen. So what other types of questions do we study? We currently have a study going on the audiobook processing of multimodal input. We have one of our students is working on a study about linguistic prediction in emerging literates. We have work on the output hypothesis and many other topics. Indeed, one of the nice things about this methodology is that it's so versatile and that you can do so many different things with it. And so I thought, you know, there's no better way to give you a flavor of what eye tracking can do than to show you what it looks like. And so I'd like to share with you now a very brief video that was recorded in the iLink lab, and that shows what the start of an experiment looks like. There we go. My name is Aline Godfroid, and I work in the Second Language Studies and TESOL program here at Michigan State University. I co-direct the Second Language Studies Eye Tracking Lab, and today I'd like to invite you to come on a tour with me of the iLink Eye Tracking Lab. In the iLink lab, we have an iLink eye tracker manufactured by SR Research in Canada. It comes with two PCs. Here on my right, your left, is the host PC, where I'll be sitting to control the experiment. And over here on my left, your right, is the participant PC, where the participant will engage with the experiment. So I'd like to invite my lovely research assistant, Brittany Finch, to demonstrate what this looks like. With adult participants, we use the chin rest and forehead rest for recordings so that we can get maximally accurate and high quality data during the recording. In addition to having this headrest and chin rest, we also have some other important parts of our camera and setup that are essential to the recording. In particular, we have the eye tracking lens here, which we can zoom in or out of the participant's eye, and which we'll use to film the eye during the experiment. This will give us the exact position and location of the eye. Next to the lens is the infrared illuminator that is emitting light onto Brittany's eyes. And it is the reflection of this light that we are filming, and that in combination with geometrical principles will give us the exact position of Brittany's eyes on the screen. So it's as simple as that, the setup of our eye tracker. And so this is an example of a reading experiment on the eye tracker, and we can see what it looks like on the participant's side of the screen. Brittany is currently reading the text, and we are filming her eye movements. To ensure that we have maximally accurate data and high quality, we laid out the text in double spaced, and we also used an equal width font. So this will help the camera clearly distinguish where Brittany is currently looking at. Now, when we look at what the experiment looks like on the researcher's side of the screen, we see one of the great beauties of eye tracking, which is that we can follow along word for word the eye gaze cursor. We know exactly where Brittany is looking as she is reading this text. And this gives us perfect spatial information and temporal information that we can then use to study such questions as syntactic processing, lexical processing, the role of attention in language learning, and many, many other things. Thank you again for watching the video. My name is Aline Godfroid, and this is the Second Language Studies Eye Tracking Lab. If you would like more information about our lab, or are thinking about studying at MSU or visiting our lab, please visit our website, eyetrack.msu.domains, and the website of our program, sls.msu.edu.
All right. So let's bring, there we go, back. So the studies that I'll be presenting today were all conducted here. This is the setting where our research takes place. So, oh, hi, there we go. So yeah, now let's look at what this equipment can give us in terms of information and why it's been used so widely in SLA. Applied researchers like ourselves record eye movements because they believe that the eye movements can provide a window into the mind. Concretely, we know that humans and higher order animals tend to align their line of sight, their eye gaze, with what they're currently attending to. This is called an orienting response. We look at what we're currently attending to, and it's a form of attention allocation.
It's a form of attention allocation that is called overt attention, overt because we can see it, we can measure it, and it's believed to coincide with the processing that is currently going on inside the mind, which we cannot see. It's covert attention, but which is what we are eventually interested in studying. And so the link between these two processes, overt and covert attention, has become known as the eye-mind link and is foundational to all the eye tracking research that we do. And so to unpack this a little further, and this idea of an attentional paradigm, I'd like to share with you an extract from a data extract from a study that I did a few years ago here with colleagues at Michigan State University. So on the screen that you saw in the video when Brittany was reading, there's lots of information. And eye tracking researchers tend not to analyze all of that information. Instead, they tend to be interested in very specific areas, very specific parts of the screen, of the text, of the sentence that are linked to their research hypotheses. In order to extract the data from these regions, they tend to define what are called interest areas, or sometimes also known as regions of interest. Right? So these are the parts for which we're going to analyze the eye tracking data. And as you can see here in these examples, there is a wealth of information that we can extract, that we can get from this data, from the eye movement record. So specifically what you are seeing here is a sequence of eye fixations that one reader made as he or she was reading this sentence. So all the bubbles represent eye fixations, and the arrows indicate the order in which these fixations were made. And furthermore, the size of the bubble is proportional to the length of the fixation. So when we have larger bubbles, we know that the reader spent more time looking at and processing and extracting information from this particular area on the screen. Moreover, we can see, because of the sequence in which these, according to which these events unfold, we can get information about what happens very early on during processing and what happens later. And this distinction between early and late measures of eye movement processing is believed to map onto distinct cognitive processes in the mind as well. And we see more on that later in the Maie and Godfroid study. And so when we compare then records for different participants, sometimes in different experimental conditions, we can make comparisons with regard to early versus late processing. For instance, this participant here on the top had a very early response to this unknown target word, whereas the participant on the bottom had a much later response, initially just kept reading before they then revisited. So we can compare early versus late processing, and we can also compare overall processing, overall attention on regions of interest in the screen, potentially, if we're so interested, linking this to outcomes later, learning outcomes. And so all of this provides a wealth of information with regards to attention and with regards to processing. So we have eye movement registration. Of course, there are other methodologies available in the field that share with eye tracking the ability to measure what people are doing in real time. Right? So we see processes unfold as they are happening. And the two most commonly used behavioral methods, in addition to and besides eye tracking, are think aloud protocols or concurrent verbalizations, where people are asked to say out aloud what they're thinking as they are doing a task, as well as self-paced reading, where people are pressing a button in order to read a sentence, typically one word or one segment at a time. So these are the two other methodologies that are most directly related to eye tracking methodology. And so in the book on eye tracking methodology that I published in 2020, I provide a comparison of these three methods. And so you'll see that eye tracking provides primarily quantitative data in that it tells us how long and how many times somebody looked in a given region compared to think alouds, for instance, which provide primarily qualitative data. Eye tracking is exquisitely suited, very well suited to study both written and auditory language processing, both comprehension and production, which is a strength of the methodology, together with the fact that it provides a very high fine-grained temporal and spatial resolution. So it provides us with a millisecond precise information and the ability to distinguish in fine detail where somebody is looking on the screen. Overall, as described in detail also in the book, there's a great number of areas of second language research and bilingualism research where eye tracking has now been used successfully, and the number of applications continue to increase each year. So it's really a very versatile method that can be used to study many different types of questions, which is perhaps its very greatest strength, I would say, that it's so versatile. On the downside, learning how to conduct eye tracking research does come with a little bit of a learning curve. So it takes a little bit of time to understand important principles in designing a study, how to design a well-controlled and informative experiment, and also how to collect data in a valid and accurate manner so that we can trust the results that we get. Obviously, there's training and there's workshops and there's resources available. So it can be done, but it's not exactly an off-the-shelf methodology. The purchase of an eye tracker, a higher end eye tracker, also still comes with a $30,000 to $40,000 price tag nowadays, which certainly represents a threshold if your program or university doesn't have one. I know UCL is well equipped, so if you work there, there's no problem. But some people do not have access to an eye tracker in their programs, and so there's a few things you can do. Then you can reach out maybe to other departments or units at your university. When I started, we didn't have an eye tracker in the linguistics program. And so I actually knocked on the door of the psychology program asking if they would please let me use their eye tracker. And that's sort of how I wiggled my way into the world of eye tracking research. So you can reach out to other people. It's also possible to rent an eye tracker, or if you're writing a grant, to write the eye tracker into your grant. So it can be done, but it may require some creativity and proactive initiative in the beginning. So let's look then, with this background, let's look at some recent work. The first study that I would like to present is a study I did in collaboration with Myung-Un Song and Jongbong Lee at Michigan State University. Both of them are now at Nagoya University of Commerce in Japan. And this study is available in first view in studies in second language acquisition. And so for this study, we revisited a long-standing question in the field of second language acquisition with regard to attention to form and meaning. Bill VanPatten, as early as 1990 in his input processing theory, put forward that second language learners cannot pay attention to form and meaning simultaneously. And this is so, he argued, because they possess limited attentional processing capacity. And so they're forced to prioritize one type of information over the other. VanPatten put forward that the information that learners prioritize is the meaning of a linguistic text. And so his primacy of meaning principle states that learners process the meaning of new linguistic information before they process its form. These ideas have been very influential in the field of second language acquisition, and they have inspired a series of interconnected studies, replications, conceptual replications, extensions with other language groups, and so on, that basically continue to this day. So we have about 30 years of research looking at this question of whether second language learners can process the form while they're also attending to the meaning of input. And very interestingly here, if we look at the results that these studies have found, we see a little bit of a shift around the late 2000s. And so the initial studies all found support for VanPatten's primacy of meaning principle. So what they found is that when learners read a text or listen to a text for comprehension, and at the same time are instructed to pay attention to certain grammatical forms in that text, their comprehension will suffer compared to those who read or listen to the text for comprehension only. And then, as mentioned, 2008, there was a study by Liao and colleagues and subsequent work by Morgan Short and her colleagues that did not find such a trade-off, as we call it, in form and meaning comprehension. Interestingly, this shift, if you will, in results coincided with methodological developments and arguably refinements in terms of how attention has been measured. And so in these initial studies by VanPatten and his colleagues, there was no concurrent real-time measurement of attention. The way that attention was operationalized in these studies was by asking participants to either put a check mark or circle or underline a given grammatical form every time they read or heard the form in the input. So it was sort of a paper-based, paper and pencil type of operationalization of attention. And so in 2008, Ron Liao and his colleagues innovated the study of simultaneous attention to form and meaning by introducing for the first time a concurrent measure of attention in the form of think aloud protocols. And so in his study, as well as in the Morgan Short et al. 2012 study, participants were asked to say their thoughts out loud as they were reading or listening, as they were reading, in this case, as they were reading the text. And so these verbal protocols provided us with a window into people's thought processes. And so they could also tell us whether people were indeed paying attention to and processing the target forms as they had been assigned. Now, the innovation that, we proposed in the Son et al. Study was to introduce eye tracking as a non-intrusive and complete measure of attention. So, so compared to either no measurement, online measurement of attention or think aloud protocols, the eye tracker is filming people's visual attention, orienting the entire time. And so even if people do not comment on a form per se, which often happens when they're reading, we might still get from the data, we will still get from eye tracking data, some information about whether they looked at the form, how long they looked at the form, whether they went back to it, and so on. So no measure here, non-intrusive and complete by its nature. And what we did is we had a total of 84 English-speaking second language Spanish students of Spanish here at Michigan State University. They were third semester Spanish students. And they came to the lab, which you saw, on an individual basis, and read a Spanish text passage while their eye movements were being recorded. After that, they answered a number of comprehension questions about the text, which they had been told beforehand they would be asked to answer. And then this was the first study where we also included an independent measure of the learner's Spanish proficiency, because it's been hypothesized that this trade-off between form and meaning will also depend on learners' proficiency, will be more pronounced at lower proficiency levels. So that was the design. For the text reading, we had a control group that read the text for comprehension only. And then we had a total of 4 experimental groups, which also read the text for comprehension, but additionally were instructed to pay attention to one of four different forms in the text. And we told them to click on the form every time they encountered it in the text, and to keep their eyes fixated on the form for 2 seconds. And so these were the 4 experimental groups that differed with regard to their task instructions. We had a group that was instructed to attend to sol, which means sun in Spanish and is a lexical item. Then we had the group instructed to attend to the preverbal clitic lo, which is a lexico-grammatical item. And then 2 groups attended to grammatical items, the definite article la, and the third person plural marker, verbal plural marker n, a bound suffix, bound morpheme. And so, so here you see, for instance, what it would look like. For the group that got the definite article la, every time they're reading this text, right? They're reading a text for comprehension, and when they come across the definite article, they're supposed to click on it, look at it for 2 seconds, keep reading, till the next part. And while they're doing this the whole time, we are recording their eye movements as a measure of their attention. And so we had different measures in the study. Operationalization of form was the clicking, and then the eye fixations on the target form. For attention to meaning, the participants completed the comprehension test after the task. And additionally, and newly in this study, we analyzed their eye movement measures for the entire reading text, right? So we also looked at, okay, we know they're going, or they're instructed to pay attention to these target forms, but what does this actually do to their reading behavior for the text overall? How does this actually compare to someone who's just reading the text for comprehension? And here we did a lexical, a word level analysis, as well as a text level analysis. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to go to the juicy bits directly. You can find the other parts in the paper, but essentially participants clicked on the target forms as they had been instructed to, and they also looked on the assigned target forms. So everybody included in the analysis complied with the task instructions, performed the task as instructed. So moving on then, as I said, to the exciting parts regarding attention to meaning. How does this instruction to attend to form interact with text comprehension and text processing? Well, let's take a look at text comprehension first. What you're seeing here are the results on the post-test, the post-test comprehension score. These numbers are out of 10. And it is really interesting to see how, in terms of descriptive statistics, the pattern of results follows the predictions of, follows VanPatten's predictions perfectly. So we have the control group scoring highest, followed by the two groups that were instructed to attend to the lexical and the lexicogrammatical form. Finally, the two groups instructed to attend to the grammatical forms, to la and to n, scored the lowest. So this descriptively, we see the predicted hierarchy in terms of how attending to form may impact comprehension. Statistically, the comparison that was borne out statistically was that between the two groups attending to the grammatical items, the most difficult items, la and n, scoring significantly lower in terms of text comprehension than the meaning-only control group, with the lexicogrammatical and lexical group somewhere in between these two groups. Right? But so looking at the offline, the post-test data, we see support for the primacy of meaning principle. Now, let's look at, we have a trade-off here, right? A cost in comprehension. Let's look at what the reading data, what the text reading data looked like. This table here can look a little intimidating in terms of amount of information, but I will walk you through it very nicely. Basically, what it is showing is a total of 4 regression analyses, one for each of the eye movement measures that we analyzed in the study. And what we were interested in this analysis is whether the 4 experimental groups, which are represented here every time, one line for each of the experimental groups with dummy coding, whether the 4 experimental groups differed significantly on the eye movement measures compared to the meaning-only, the meaning-focused control group, which represents the intercept in the regression analysis. Right? So we're comparing the reading behavior, the text reading behavior for the experimental groups with the meaning-focused control group. And so what this analysis shows is a lot of non-significant p-values, right? Many of them are fairly high. So what it's indicating is that the 4 experimental groups processed the text with the exception of the target words. We left the target words out of this analysis, but all the other words are in the text similarly to the meaning-based control group in terms of length of fixation, number of fixation, overall text reading time, and number of regressions in the text, right? The experimental groups could not be distinguished from the control group other than with regard to their attention to the target forms. So, instruction to attend to form did not interfere with overall text processing as far as the eye movement data can tell us, right? We don't see anything special here in the eye movement data. And yet we found this decrement in comprehension, remember. So although the groups overall did not show any differences in their text reading behavior, within each group, we found individual differences in text reading behavior, individual differences that were predictive of text comprehension. And that's what I'm going to show you next. So what you have here are the same 4 dependent variables, eye movement measures that we analyzed. This time, they're plotted on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have text comprehension scores, right, on the offline comprehension post-test. Every dot in this graph represents one participant, and the different colored lines, we have 5 lines, or orange for control group, and then 4 other colors for the form-focused experimental groups, represents the pattern or trend that was apparent or visible in these groups. In other words, we're trying to look at how does overall text reading behavior relate to post-test comprehension scores, right? Now, the pattern that is visible across these 4 measures and is the same and statistically the same across these 4 measures is the pattern whereby those who read more slowly and carefully, for instance, by making a greater number of fixations, are the ones that also score more highly on the comprehension post-test. And this result held true even though or after we controlled for simultaneous attention to form. So what we're seeing here basically is that the instruction to attend to a form while also reading the text for meaning will cause a decrement in comprehension scores. There's a trade-off, a form-meaning trade-off going on. However, this can be overwritten by a participant's individual reading strategy. And remember, we controlled for proficiency. So those readers who either by training or by disposition tend to be more slow and more careful in their reading behavior show better comprehension. And so the summary that we proposed in our studies then is that these slow and careful readers seem to be able to handle the competing demands on their attention just fine, which in turn enables them to comprehend context as well as attend to form. When we bring this back to the series of interconnected studies and the line of research that we aim to contribute to in this study, our result can thus best be summarized as follows. We found a trade-off between attention to form and meaning, bringing the pendulum back to the early studies of the 1990s and early 2000s. However, we also found that the picture may be a little more complicated than that, and that while there is at the group level, there is this trade-off, individual differences in terms of how participants approach the task may override this effect, right? And such that slow and careful readers may still be able to juggle attention to form and meaning simultaneously. So I guess the last word on form and meaning has not been spoken yet, has not been said yet. And I welcome very much further research in this area. But this is a first application of eye tracking methodology in attentional lines of work. The second application that I would like to present to you next is work that I did in collaboration with Rio Maie here at Michigan State University, and that is now available on First View in language learning. And in this study, Rio and I contributed to a body of work that is concerned with the construct validity of acceptability judgment tests, also known as grammaticality judgment tests. And so acceptability judgment tests are one of the oldest and most widely used tasks in linguistics in the SLA. And so they're fairly straightforward tasks whereby participants are asked to read a sentence or listen to a sentence and make a judgment with regard to whether the sentence is grammatical or not. And so in the studies that we did here, we combined this with eye movement recording. In the field of SLA, acceptability judgment tests have been used to measure participants' explicit grammar knowledge, which is defined as a conscious verbalizable knowledge of forms and regularities that second language learners can access slowly and with effort. In the last 20 years or so, there have also been several investigations looking at whether it's possible to manipulate the task to render it a measure of either implicit or automatized explicit knowledge. Knowledge of grammar in this case that can be accessed rapidly, and that is either for implicit knowledge, tacit and unconscious, and believed to be acquired mainly through exposure to rich input, for instance, in immersion contexts, or in the case of automatized explicit knowledge, knowledge that still retains a level of consciousness but can also be accessed rapidly as a result of extensive practice with the language. Right? So the question is, if we ask participants to perform a written acceptability judgment task, for instance, under time pressure, will that provide us with a valid measure of their either implicit or their automatized explicit knowledge? Because these are types of knowledge that are difficult to measure, so we're always looking for valid ways of measuring them. And so, again, there's been a substantial body of work in this area, of which I presented here on the screen some of the most representative studies, but there are more. And as you can see, once again, there's a little bit of a pendulum swinging back and forth and contradictory results with regards to what times written GJTs may measure. In particular, Ellis 2005 and recently Godfroid and Kim argued that they measure implicit knowledge, whereas work by De Keyser, Suzuki, and Vaffe and colleagues argued that they measure automatized explicit knowledge. Now, the studies that you see here, they're all based on large batteries of tests. So acceptability judgment tests together with many other tests of grammar. And they're based on the factor analysis of the accuracy scores on these tests. So they're looking at outcome measures only. And so I've also contributed to this work most recently, but another thing that I've been working on with colleagues is to introduce a process-based perspective to this line of research by introducing the recording of eye movements in AJTs to get a sense of, well, what does the processing actually look like in timed and untimed conditions? And so the first study in this area was Godfroid et al. 2015, published in Studies in Second Language Acquisition. And in that study, my colleagues and I analyzed only one eye movement measure, regressions. And we demonstrated that performing a GJT under time pressure will suppress the number of regressions. So the number of times that people go back to read the sentence during task performance, which has been linked to reduction in controlled processing and reduction in use of explicit knowledge. Now, one limitation of this study was that we only looked at one measure of eye movements. And so we didn't really look at the full picture of how processing is affected under time pressure. And so this is what Rio and I did in this new study. We expanded our number of measures from 1 to 4, and we sampled them carefully in a theoretically justified manner so that they would reflect the distinction between control and automatic processing. Furthermore, we considered the role of our participants, our test takers' individual differences in lexical processing automaticity. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. So a little more about the theoretical framework. As I mentioned, our eye movement measures were theoretically informed, and specifically they were informed by a dual process theory. Dual process theory is a theory of attention that views attention on a spectrum ranging from controlled to automatic processing. Controlled processing refers to cognitive activity that is activated under control of and through attention by the subject, and is believed to be slow, serial, effortful, and requires the expansion of attentional resources. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have automatic processing, which is processing that takes place without the necessity of active control or attention. And so in contrast to controlled processing, automatic processing is believed to be fast, to be able to happen in parallel, effortlessly, and with minimal cognitive effort. And so this distinction between controlled and automatic processing actually maps very nicely onto the distinction between early and late eye movement measures that we discussed earlier in the talk, whereby early eye movement measures are measures that reflect what happens when participants first visit a word or a region of interest. And so they're believed to reflect very, very fast and effortless processing, potentially linked to a lexical access, and not be under the participants, under the reader's conscious control, the same way that late eye movement measures are. Late eye movement measures are measures that happen during second, third pass, and so on reading during subsequent visits to the same area. And so they're believed to be linked much more tightly to controlled processing, to reanalysis of previously visited regions. Now, this distinction, furthermore, between automatic and controlled processing may map onto the distinction between implicit and explicit knowledge if we follow definitions by Rod Ellis, for instance, who will say that implicit knowledge can be drawn on automatically without much conscious effort, while explicit knowledge requires more conscious deploying of attentional resources. So against that framework, right, we conducted this grammaticality judgment study, looking at whether time pressure will affect these processes, automatic versus controlled, differently, to different extents. This is what I will show you here. So participants came to the same lab, individual data collection. We had 30 native English speakers and 39 advanced second language speakers of English. And all of them completed both a timed and an untimed version, counterbalanced, of the acceptability judgment test. The timed version of the test is believed, based on theory and the background that I shared with you, to draw primarily on participants' automatic processing of these sentences and automatic activation of linguistic knowledge. In contrast, the untimed AJT allows for free deployment of both automatic and controlled, and especially controlled processing. Right? And so we're looking here, if you contrast the two, we're looking specifically at whether the addition of time pressure will suppress the use of controlled processing, things like regression, total reading time, and so on, will specifically suppress those, but leave the automatic processing intact. We recorded eye movements during both tasks, and in between the two tasks, the participants completed a semantic classification task, which is a word-based reaction time task where people make semantic judgments to individual words. And their reaction time and accuracy there provided us with a coefficient of variation measure, also known as CV, which is a measure of a lexical processing automaticity, and which was our individual differences measure in this study. So now on to the results. We will take a look at the results for native speakers first. What we have here on the x-axis is the participants' lexical processing automaticity. Faster, more automatic, more stable participants are plotted on the left, and slower, more variable, less automatic participants are plotted on the right. That's what you see here. In addition, we have a performance on the untimed GJT in blue and the timed GJT in red. And we have the 4 dependent variables, the 4 eye tracking measures that we analyzed as our dependent variable. First pass reading time was our measure of automatic processing. And then we had an additional 3 measures of controlled processing, later eye tracking measures. And so what you see in these 4 graphs, very similar, is overall not all that much difference. As a function of CV, the lines are pretty parallel, pretty flat, and a little longer viewing time in the untimed GJT than the timed GJT, but not greatly so. Now, so there's little difference between the 2 test conditions in terms of how our native speakers engage with the test sentences. Now, if we contrast this with the second language speakers, we see a very different picture indeed. The picture that we see here, and it is most pronounced indeed for the measures of controlled processing and not the measure of automatic processing, is that we get a big divergence, right? The lines start to separate. We have a 3-way interaction, a big divergence between how participants perform the untimed GJT in blue and how they perform the timed GJT in red. However, this is conditional on their lexical processing automaticity. So it's the slower readers in particular that use much more controlled processing in the untimed test than in the timed test. When given an opportunity, slower readers attempt to draw on their explicit knowledge in the untimed tests, which they do not have time to do in the timed test. Interestingly, the fast readers, right, the ones with fast automatic lexical processing skills, they will perform the timed and untimed AJT pretty similarly, right? So they will be drawing on the same type of knowledge. We can call it implicit, we can call it automatized explicit, but they will be drawing on the same type of knowledge, regardless of whether you give them time pressure or not. So the result for the second language speakers is that there's an increase in reading behavior in the untimed GJT, specifically for those L2 speakers who have slow lexical processing automaticity. This result is most pronounced for the late measures of eye movements believed to reflect controlled processing. However, we found some statistical evidence for a similar thing happening in the early measure of automatic processing as well. So going counter for that part to our initial hypothesis. So the results then can be summarized as follows. Adding time pressure to a test may not work as theoretically predicted, right? The initial idea was if we add time to pressure to a test, it will make the test a measure of implicit or automatized explicit knowledge, and it will do so for people across the board. In reality, the picture we see is more complex, where it really depends on your participants' lexical processing skills. If you have fast automatic readers, they will perform the test the same way, regardless of whether you add time pressure or not. And it's likely to be implicit or automatized explicit. For slow readers, adding time pressure to a test does make a very big difference. Furthermore, we found, confirming earlier results by Godfroid and colleagues, we found the predicted reduction in controlled processing associated with a reduction in explicit knowledge, but we also found a smaller reduction in automatic processing that we cannot readily explain with the existing theoretical frameworks. The conclusion then is that the construct validity of these tests depends in important ways on individual differences in the test taker's profile. And these individual differences, I would argue, need to be taken into account in our work in order to come to a more comprehensive picture of what is actually happening. In Son et al. Study, we found, to recap, that reading speed may affect comprehension above and beyond the specific task manipulations in the reading task, right? It may trump, reading speed may trump simultaneous attention. In Maie and Godfroid's study, we found that participants' lexical processing skills have a large influence on how they will experience the task. And so again, lexical processing skills may trump the introduction of a time manipulation. And so one thing I'd love to talk with you about during the Q&A is what other individual difference factors you think we should be controlling for, either in eye tracking studies or in other types of SLA research. To conclude, if that is fine, let me check. You know, we're getting close to 10, but I think I started around 10:05. So is it 9:05? Okay. Let me see. Yes, I'd like to leave you with just a few pointers. Hopefully, by this point, you know, you've become excited about eye tracking, developed an appetite, and maybe you're thinking, oh, it's really something that I'd like to do. Maybe you're already doing research. Of course, there's a lot of expertise in this room, and so a few pointers that I wanted to share. If you'd like more information, I can direct you to these field-specific reference guides, as well as special issues that have come out in the last decade. Now, I would encourage people looking for a research topic to start putting on eye tracking goggles, like this gentleman here who has his eye tracking goggles on, when reading papers and thinking about what would this study stand to gain if we replicated it, but added eye movement registration to the study, right? Concurrent measurement of attention, what could it give us that we cannot get from a study that uses perhaps post-test only, or that how would it complement a study that uses verbal data, for instance? There's a lot of work with self-paced reading that is ready and waiting to be replicated with eye tracking. Eye tracking is a more natural way of reading, because people can go back in the sentence and they can read at their natural speed, which is about twice as fast as they do in self-paced reading. And so looking at, does this change processing when people are able to read a text naturally? And then currently there have been about 150 studies that have been published in our field to date with eye tracking, and that are a great base to start building on. What we need in particular, I think, in the field, what is lacking is replications. either replications of L2 eye tracking work. Like I said, there's about 150, and the number is growing every year. But also replications of studies from the L1 literature. There's wonderful work happening with native speakers, both children and adults, that is waiting to be replicated with adult second language speakers, and that provides a good entry point into the field. Finally, as I mentioned, there have been a handful of studies that have added eye tracking data to previous studies with offline measures only, but there's many more studies where this could be done to great profit. Now, if you do decide to design an eye tracking study, there's a few pointers that Bronson, Hui, and I published in 2020, pitfalls and how to avoid them in eye tracking research that I'd like to share with you. I think it's important to design studies that are theory-driven or hypothesis-driven. So the eye tracker, it is very easy to put someone in front of a screen with an eye tracker and start filming what they look at. And while this looks appealing and enticing, it can be very potentially problematic to interpret the results that you get, because the eye gaze is influenced by many different factors. And so in order to be able to draw valid conclusions, it is important that we build in things like control conditions, carefully matched conditions that can be compared to one another, so that we can, with more confidence, attribute differences in gaze patterns to what it is that we want to study. A second point is that there is a very large number of eye movement measures that is available. This is a figure both from the Godfroid and Hui paper as well as from my eye tracking book. And I think that is a great strength and wealth of the technique. It is possible to sample from these different measures in a theory-driven manner, as exemplified, for instance, also in the Maie and Godfroid paper. And so to include both early and late measures, as well as measures of duration, but also count and location, and to make full use of the richness that, that comes with eye tracking data. Third, eye trackers differ in their properties. They differ in their price tags, but they also differ in their technical properties. And so this can have an influence on the type of study that can be run. So in general, the smaller the phenomenon you want to look at on the screen, the more accurate the eye tracker you will need to have. And then lastly, what I'd like to leave you with is that the collection of eye tracking data is time intensive, and from that point of view, it's a relatively expensive enterprise. And I think we are becoming a community of people using similar methods and partially pursuing similar questions. And I think we owe it to each other and to current and future researchers to, as much as possible, share our data, share our materials, and share our codes on frameworks like the Open Science Framework and IRIS for others to benefit and to build on. And so as eye tracking researchers, we can be leaders in open science in our field and model these practices so that over time, we engage in more and more reproducible research. So thank you so much for listening. I hope there were interesting things, a little bit interesting for everybody. And please do not hesitate to get in touch if you have questions, either now or after the talk. I'd be happy to chat more.
Thank you very much, Aline, for this wonderful and really inspiring talk.